In 1876, a journalist named Charles Clark wrote a cover story for Scribner's Monthly declaring Hartford, Connecticut, the richest city in the United States. Not the biggest, not the fastest growing, the richest per capita by his arithmetic, wealthier than New York, wealthier than Boston, wealthier than Philadelphia. His math was generous, maybe even a little creative. He was counting the assets of Hartford's insurance companies as if they belonged to the people who lived there, which they didn't exactly. But the claim stuck. It stuck because when you walked the streets of Hartford in the 1870s, it didn't feel wrong. The houses were enormous. The elms were enormous. The money was everywhere. Not flashy money, not railroad baron money, but deep money, old river money, quiet and immovable, the kind of money that insures other people's money. And here's the part that should stop you. That same city, that richest city, appeared on the census rolls by the 1980s as one of the 10 poorest cities in America, and it hasn't climbed out since. The distance between those two facts is the whole story. To understand how Hartford got so rich, you have to start with the river. The Connecticut River is the longest in New England, and Hartford sits right where it bends and widens, about 50 miles from Long Island Sound. The Dutch got there first. Adrian Block sailed up the river in 1614, and by 1633, the Dutch West India Company had built a trading post they called the House of Hope, Fort Goedhoop, right at the confluence of the Little Park River and the Big Connecticut. They were trading beaver pelts with the Saukeog people, who had been living on that land for thousands of years. The Dutch drew maps, named things, planted their flag, but they didn't bring enough settlers, and the English were coming. In 1636, a Puritan minister named Thomas Hooker led about 100 people and 130 head of cattle on a 2-week trek through the wilderness from Newtown, what's now Cambridge, Massachusetts. They settled just north of the Dutch fort, on land they purchased from the Saukeog chief Sequasin. Hooker was no ordinary preacher. He was a man with ideas about power. 2 years after arriving on May 31st, 1638, he delivered a sermon in which he said something that had essentially never been said before in colonial America. The foundation of authority, Hooker declared, is laid firstly in the free consent of the people, not in a king, not in a charter, in the people. That idea became the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, adopted in January 1639, what many historians consider the first written constitution in the Western world. It's why the license plates say Constitution State. The whole thing started in Hartford, in a wooden meeting house, from the mouth of a man who'd been run out of England for thinking too freely. The settlement grew. It was a river town, and river towns in New England had a natural advantage. They could ship goods to the coast and from the coast to the world. By the 1700s, Hartford was trading up and down the eastern seaboard, lumber, livestock, provisions going south to the Caribbean, and rum, sugar, and manufactured goods flowing back. The Connecticut River was the spine of the colony's economy, and Hartford was the vertebra where everything connected. But the thing that would define Hartford for 2 centuries started, oddly enough, with fire. Not its own fire, other people's fires. In the early 1800s, Hartford's merchants were worried about the risks of the trade they depended on. Ships sank, warehouses burned, goods vanished. So in 1810, a group of them pooled $15,000 in working capital and formed the Hartford Fire Insurance Company. It was one of the first such companies in the nation, and it was built on an insight so simple it's almost invisible. If you could spread risk across enough policyholders, you could make money from other people's fear of losing everything. Other companies followed quickly. The Aetna Fire Insurance Company was organized in 1819, born, according to the company's own lore, out of a heated argument among Hartford businessmen at Morgan's Exchange Coffee House on State Street. They were debating the inefficiency of the state's existing fire insurance and decided they could do better. Connecticut Mutual Life opened its doors in 1846, adding life insurance to the portfolio. The Travelers Insurance Company was founded in 1864, and it became the first casualty insurance company in North America, the company that would eventually insure the first automobile, the first commercial airline flight, the first space travel. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company started in 1866, insuring the machines that were powering the Industrial Revolution. One after another, they set up shop along Main Street and State Street in dignified brick buildings with tall windows and heavy doors, and they grew. The growth wasn't accidental. Hartford's insurance companies were aggressive, and they were smart. When fire tore through New York's financial district in December 1835, one of the worst urban fires in American history, the president of Hartford Fire Insurance, Eliphalet Terry, did something remarkable. He got on a horse and rode to New York. He found his policyholders in the smoldering ruins and told them, face to face, that every claim would be paid in full. Many New York insurers defaulted. Hartford paid. The reputation this built was worth more than any advertising campaign. By the time Abraham Lincoln was buying a house in Springfield, Illinois, he insured it through a Hartford company. Everyone did. Hartford became synonymous with the word insurance, the way Detroit would later become synonymous with automobiles. And while the insurance men were building their empires of paper and actuarial tables, another Hartford native was building something very different. Samuel Colt was born in Hartford in 1814, the son of a textile worker, a boy who got himself expelled from school and was sent on a sailing voyage to learn discipline. On that ship, watching the capstan turn and lock, he carved a wooden model of a revolving pistol mechanism. It was one of those moments where a bored kid's idle hands changed the world. Colt patented his design in 1836, failed spectacularly with his first factory in Paterson, New Jersey, and then got lucky. The Mexican-American War created demand, and a Texas Ranger named Samuel Walker wrote him a letter raving about the gun's performance in combat. Colt filled an order for 1,000 revolvers, and suddenly he was in business. In 1855, he came home. Colt bought cheap flood-prone land along the Connecticut River's South Meadows, built a 2-mile dike to hold back the water, and erected an armory that was the largest private arms factory in the world. The complex was producing 150 weapons a day. Its most distinctive feature was, and still is, a blue onion-shaped dome, topped with a gilded rampant Colt, inspired, people said, by the domes Colt saw on a trip to Russia. You can see it from Interstate 91 today, this strange, beautiful, vaguely Byzantine ornament rising above the Hartford skyline. Inside that factory, Colt pioneered interchangeable parts and assembly line methods that would later define American manufacturing. He didn't invent mass production exactly, but he perfected it, and he showed it off. At the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, he disassembled 10 revolvers and reassembled them using random parts, just to prove they were interchangeable. The British were stunned. They called it the American system of manufacturing, and it started in Hartford. Colt died in 1862 at only 47, but the company survived him, because his wife Elizabeth was as formidable as he was. When the armory was nearly destroyed by fire in 1864, $2 million in damage, Elizabeth Colt made a decision that would have broken most people. Samuel had never bothered to insure his own buildings, an irony almost too perfect for the insurance capital of the world. But Elizabeth, who had taken out insurance policies after his death, used the payout to rebuild on the same site. The rebuilt East Armory opened in 1867 with the same blue dome, the same gilded Colt. The factory went on to produce the Colt single-action Army revolver, the gun that won the West, and would remain a major Hartford employer through 2 world wars. By the time of the Civil War, Hartford was becoming something more than a prosperous river town. It was becoming a city of national consequence. The insurance companies were growing exponentially, fueled by the war itself and the Reconstruction economy that followed. Colt's Armory was running at full capacity, and in 1842, a Hartford patron named Daniel Wadsworth had done something quietly extraordinary. He donated land, money, and part of his personal art collection to establish the Wadsworth Athenaeum, a cultural institution devoted to art, history, and learning. It opened to the public in 1844 in a Gothic revival building designed by Ithiel Town and Alexander Jackson Davis, a castle, essentially, in the middle of downtown Hartford. It is the oldest continuously operating public art museum in the United States, the country's oldest. And it opened in Hartford, not New York, not Philadelphia, not Boston. Hartford. Wadsworth's father, Jeremiah, had been a Revolutionary War leader and wealthy Hartford entrepreneur. Daniel, an amateur artist himself, became a patron of Thomas Cole and Frederick Edwin Church, the masters of the Hudson River School. The museum he founded would later receive a staggering bequest from Elizabeth Colt, over 1,000 objects, including her late husband's collection of firearms and armor. and the personal collections of J. Pierpont Morgan, the financier, who was a Hartford native and whose family donated ancient bronzes, Renaissance ceramics, and Meissen porcelains. By the early 20th century, the Wadsworth Athenaeum was acquiring works by Caravaggio, Dalí, and Mondrian before anyone else in America. In 1933, the museum sponsored George Balanchine's immigration from the Soviet Union, and the following year, the first public performance of what would become the New York City Ballet took place in the Athenaeum's Avery Memorial Theater. All of this happened in Hartford, Connecticut. And then there was the park. In 1853, a congregational minister named Horace Bushnell stood before the Hartford City Council and argued for something no American city had ever done: using public funds to buy land for a public park. Not a donated estate, not a private garden open to the public, but a park bought and built with taxpayer money. The site he proposed was, to put it charitably, a mess: pigsties, tanneries, a soapworks, a garbage dump, the polluted little Park River running through the middle of it. Bushnell called it hell without the fire. Hard-nosed businessmen protested. They didn't want taxable land taken off the rolls. But Bushnell was persuasive. He spoke for over an hour, painting a vision of what he called an outdoor parlor, a green carpet of ground where high and low, rich and poor will exchange looks. In November, the council voted unanimously, and on January 5, 1854, Hartford's voters approved the expenditure, over $100,000, by a margin of more than 2 to 1. It was the first publicly funded municipal park in the United States. Bushnell asked his friend Frederick Law Olmsted, a Hartford native, to design it. Olmsted was busy with Central Park and declined, but he recommended a Swiss-born landscape architect named Jacob Weidenmann, who planted 1,100 specimens of 157 varieties of trees and created the graceful curving paths that still exist today. Now, hold that image. This small city, population around 40,000, which has given America its first written constitution, its first public art museum, its first publicly funded park, the birthplace of mass manufacturing, and the insurance industry that underwrites the nation's wealth. And it's about to get more extraordinary. In 1868, a 32-year-old writer from Missouri named Samuel Clemens visited Hartford for the first time and wrote to a California newspaper, "Of all the beautiful towns it has been my fortune to see, this is the chief." He was dazzled. The houses were like private hotels, he said, scattered along broad streets, each sitting in the midst of about an acre of green grass. He noted specifically that Hartford dollars have a place in half the great moneyed enterprises of the Union. It was a city of 40,000 people, but it punched like a city 10 times its size. Clemens, Mark Twain, came back. He moved to Hartford's Nook Farm neighborhood, a 140-acre enclave on the city's western edge that had been developed in the 1850s by John Hooker, a direct descendant of Thomas Hooker, and his brother-in-law Francis Gillette. Nook Farm was not an ordinary neighborhood. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the most famous woman in America, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, lived there. Her sister Isabella Beecher Hooker, one of the nation's leading suffragists, lived there. Charles Dudley Warner, a journalist and essayist, lived next door to the lot Twain bought on Farmington Avenue. In 1874, Twain built his house. It cost him around $45,000 at the time. Designed by the architect Edward Tuckerman Potter, a wild, exuberant, utterly original Victorian mansion with turrets and gables and a sweeping porch that wrapped around the building so Twain could watch the sunset and the rain from different angles. People came from all over Hartford just to watch it being built. Inside, Louis Comfort Tiffany did decorative work on the interiors. Twain installed every modern convenience he could find. And then, in the rooms of that house over the next 17 years, he wrote Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and The Prince and the Pauper. The great American novels of the 19th century were written not on the Mississippi, but in Hartford, Connecticut. The novelist William Dean Howells visited Nook Farm and described a world of constant running in and out of friendly houses, where the lively hosts and guests called one another by their Christian names, and nobody bothered to knock or ring a bell. Paths crisscrossed the property between homes. Children played together across yard lines. On any given evening, you might find Twain holding court in his billiard room while Stowe dropped by to reminisce about the days before the war and the Underground Railroad. One evening in 1872, Twain and his neighbor Warner were disparaging the popular novels their wives were reading. Olivia Clemens and Susan Warner challenged the two men to write something better. The result was The Gilded Age, the novel that gave the era its name, the phrase that defines an entire period of American history. The greed, the ambition, the spectacle, the contradiction, was coined in Hartford, Connecticut, probably over dinner, with the women winning the argument. Stowe's neighbor, Harriet Beecher Stowe, had arrived at Nook Farm in 1864, already the most famous author in the country, a woman whose novel had sold hundreds of thousands of copies and been translated into dozens of languages. She would live in Hartford until her death in 1896. Think about that neighborhood for a moment. The woman who wrote the book Lincoln supposedly credited with starting the Civil War, living next door to the man who would write the greatest American novel, both of them in Hartford, both of them walking the same paths under the same elms, while the insurance money piled up downtown and the Colt factory hummed along the river. Meanwhile, downtown, Main Street was becoming something magnificent. Department stores were anchoring the retail life of the city. The most important of these was G. Fox and Company, founded by a German immigrant named Gerson Fox in 1847 as a single-room fancy goods store. Gerson's son Moses took over in 1880 and expanded the business. By the turn of the century, G. Fox occupied a substantial building on Main Street, but in January 1917, fire destroyed it entirely. Moses Fox was 66 years old. He could have retired. Instead, he announced immediately that he would build an 11-story replacement on the same site. And here's the detail that tells you everything about what Hartford was. The store's customers rallied and voluntarily paid approximately 95% of their outstanding bills to help the Fox family rebuild. That's not commerce. That's a relationship. The new G. Fox building opened in 1918 at 960 Main Street and grew over the decades into one of the largest privately owned department stores in America, eventually reaching over 1 million square feet. It had 2 restaurants. The Connecticut Room on the second floor served sit-down meals with linen tablecloths. There were fashion shows. There were Art Deco interiors, an 11-story Christmas display that children from across the state came to see, and a talking mynah bird in a cage on the 5th floor that became something of a local celebrity. The store operated the largest telephone ordering system in New England, with direct lines to towns across Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. A fleet of navy blue delivery trucks fanned out across the suburbs on assigned days. If you ordered something on Monday, the G. Fox truck might be in your driveway on Tuesday. The woman who made it all work was Beatrice Fox Auerbach, Moses's daughter, who took over in 1938 and became the only female president of a major American department store. She added employee benefits that were decades ahead of their time: retirement plans, in-store medical clinics, subsidized meals, paid vacations. She also, quietly, refused to open branch stores in the suburbs, believing that the flagship downtown store was the soul of the enterprise. That instinct was loyal and maybe fatal. G. Fox was not alone on Main Street. Sage Allen was there, and Brown Thompson, and Wise Smith. Hartford was a real shopping city, the kind of place where women put on their good clothes and took the bus downtown for an afternoon. The streets had life in them. The Hartford Courant, which had been publishing since 1764, filled its pages with society news and department store advertisements. The Bushnell Memorial Hall, designed by the firm of Corbett, Harrison, and McMurray, the same architects behind Radio City Music Hall, opened in 1930 in the Georgian Revival style, giving Hartford a performing arts venue that could seat thousands. The building had bands of ornamental limestone on its brick exterior and a granite base that made it feel both permanent and welcoming. On Main Street, the architect Henry Hobson Richardson had designed the Cheney Building back in 1876, a Romanesque commercial block that influenced a generation of American architecture. Hartford was collecting buildings the way other cities collect statues, each one a statement of intent, each one saying, "We plan to be here for a very long time." And looming over all of it, literally, was the Travelers Tower. The Travelers Insurance Company had been growing since its founding in 1864, and by 1906 it needed a proper headquarters. The architect Don Barber designed a building in stages, First a base, completed in 1906, then an expansion in 1913, and finally, in 1919, the tower itself. When it was finished, the Travelers Tower stood 527 feet tall, 24 stories, the tallest building in New England and the 7th tallest in the world. The first commercial building outside New York City to exceed 500 feet. It had a beacon light on top, a radio station, and an observation deck at the 27th floor where you could see for miles in every direction, across the Connecticut River Valley, over the tobacco farms, past the ridgeline to the west. A child growing up in the 1920s or 1930s and approaching Hartford by car would see three things break the horizon: the dome of the state capitol, the spires of the Cathedral of St. Joseph, and the Travelers Tower. It was the city's lighthouse, its signature, the physical proof that Hartford mattered. At the base of the tower, 6 elevators moved employees, and there were many of them. The Travelers' home office had about 900 workers in 1913. By 1919, that number had tripled to 3,000. By 1930, it peaked at over 5,800. Think about that. Nearly 6,000 people working in a single building complex in a city of 160,000. The insurance industry was Hartford's General Motors, its U.S. Steel, the employer that anchored everything else. And the building continued around the tower. In 1931, a few blocks west on Farmington Avenue, Aetna completed its new corporate headquarters, a massive colonial revival building designed by James Gamble Rogers. It remains the largest colonial-style building in the world. Its cupola was modeled on the old State House downtown, the building Charles Bulfinch had designed in 1796. That old State House, incidentally, is generally considered Bulfinch's first public building. The man who later designed the Massachusetts State House and the United States Capitol cut his teeth in Hartford. The Aetna building had a 1,000-seat auditorium, and underneath the auditorium carpet was a regulation basketball court, home to the Aetna Life Girls basketball team, which was widely considered one of the best women's teams in the country in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and drew 4-figure crowds to their games. James Naismith himself praised them. All of this was happening inside an insurance company headquarters. Hartford's population hit its peak in 1950. 177,397 people. The city had the oldest newspaper in continuous publication in America, the Hartford Courant, founded in 1764. It had Hartford Public High School, the second oldest secondary school in the country. It had the American School for the Deaf, founded in 1817 by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, the first institution of its kind in the nation. It had Pratt & Whitney, the machine tool company that started in Hartford in 1860, built precision instruments for the Union Army, and later moved into aircraft engines. It had the Royal Typewriter Company and the Underwood Typewriter Company. Hartford was once called the typewriter capital of the world. It had the Fuller Brush Company, and it had Colt, still making firearms, still under that blue dome. On a warm July morning in 1944, the city woke to radio broadcasts from WTIC, property of the Travelers, broadcasting from the insurance capital of the world. Workers were heading to shifts at Colt's, at Royal Typewriter, at Pratt & Whitney and United Aircraft across the river in East Hartford. It was wartime, and the factories were running around the clock. The population had swelled beyond its housing capacity. People were renting out sheds and garages. That afternoon, July 6th, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus was performing under its big top on Barber Street before a crowd of about 7,000 people, mostly women and children. The canvas tent had been waterproofed with paraffin wax dissolved in gasoline. When fire broke out on the southwest sidewall, the tent became a torch. 167 people died that afternoon, and over 700 were injured. It was the deadliest disaster in Connecticut's history, and it happened on a Thursday in the middle of a world war to an audience of mothers and children who had just wanted to see the circus. The Ringling Company eventually paid nearly $5 million to 600 families. The city buried its dead and went back to making guns and typewriters and insurance policies because there was a war to win, and Hartford was not a city that stopped. But something was shifting. You could feel it if you knew where to look, though in 1950 nobody was looking. The peak population of 177,397 in that year's census was the top of a curve, and the slope on the other side would be long and steep. What happened to Hartford over the next half-century was not a catastrophe. It was an erosion, a series of reasonable-seeming decisions, each one made by someone who thought they were solving a problem that collectively emptied a city. The first shift was the suburbs. After the war, the GI Bill and federal highway money and cheap land made it possible for families to move to West Hartford, to Wethersfield, to Glastonbury, to Simsbury. Connecticut had abolished county government in 1960, which meant there was no regional tax base, no mechanism to share the costs of the central city with the communities that depended on it for jobs. Hartford had a land area of only about 18 square miles. The suburbs could grow outward forever. Hartford could not. The insurance companies noticed. Connecticut General, one of Hartford's pillars, moved to a new modernist campus in the suburb of Bloomfield. It was designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and it was beautiful, and it was a defection. Aetna eventually built a suburban campus, too. The Hartford followed. The companies didn't leave Connecticut. They left the city. Their employees, who had walked to work downtown, now drove to office parks surrounded by parking lots. The tax revenue went with them. Then came urban renewal. In the late 1950s, Hartford city leaders, including Mayor James Kinsella, embraced the federal dollars flowing from the Housing Act of 1949 and the Highway Act of 1956. They looked at the city's east side, the old Front Street neighborhood, a working-class, heavily Italian-American area of narrow streets and small shops and walk-up apartments near the river, and declared it a slum. In June 1958, the mayor threw a brick through the window of a building to symbolically begin the demolition. They razed 12 acres, every building, every storefront, every apartment, the family restaurants, the social clubs, the barber shops, all of it gone. In its place, they built Constitution Plaza. Completed in stages from 1961 to 1964, it cost $42 million. It was a modernist office complex built on a raised platform above a parking garage, several feet above the surrounding streets. It had two plazas, a clock tower by the Japanese designer Masao Kinoshita, glass and concrete office towers, and a celebrated two-sided building for Phoenix Life Insurance that people called the Boat Building. It was supposed to connect downtown to the Connecticut River. It never did. The plaza sat above the city, disconnected from it, its retail court chronically empty, its pedestrian spaces used only by office workers on lunch breaks. The neighborhood it replaced, the noise, the cooking, the arguments, the life, was simply gone. A waitress named June Sawyer had won a contest to name the development, beating out 9,000 other entries. She took home $500 for Constitution Plaza. The irony of naming a project that displaced hundreds of families after a document about the consent of the people was apparently lost on everyone involved. Around the same time, Interstate 91 was driven through the eastern edge of the city, along the river, cutting downtown off from the waterfront entirely. Interstate 84 sliced through from east to west, its viaduct casting a permanent shadow across downtown streets. The highways were supposed to bring people in. Mostly, they made it easier for people to leave. You could now commute from Simsbury to your office in 30 minutes. Why would you live in Hartford? The West Farms Mall opened in the suburb of Farmington in the 1970s, drawing shoppers who had once driven downtown, and the Buckland Hills Mall followed in the 1980s. Each new suburban amenity was a small subtraction from Hartford's reason to exist. And in the early 1970s, Hartford's city leaders, in a move that now seems almost unbelievable, seriously considered demolishing the old State House, Charles Bulfinch's 1796 masterpiece, to build a parking garage. The backlash saved the building, but the fact that the conversation happened at all tells you how far the city's sense of itself had fallen. A city that once built monuments to permanence was now thinking about parking. The population numbers tell the story with brutal efficiency. 177,397 in 1950, 162,178 in 1960, 158,017 in 1970, 136,392 in 1980, 139,739 in 1990, a slight uptick. Then 124,121 by 2000. By 2010, it had stabilized in the low 120s, but the composition had changed entirely. The wealthy families who had built the mansions that Twain admired were in the suburbs. The insurance executives were in the suburbs. The tax base was in the suburbs. Hartford's per capita income plummeted while the metro areas stayed high. By 2015, 3 out of 10 Hartford families were living below the poverty threshold. The same city Charles Clark had crowned the richest in the nation. The stores closed one by one. Brown Thompson went first, then Sage Allen. G. Fox held on the longest, sustained by loyalty and memory, but the May Department Stores Company had bought the chain in 1965, and the suburban branches were the future. On January 29, 1993, the flagship G. Fox store at 960 Main Street, 1 million square feet, Art Deco interiors, the Connecticut room with its famous chicken pot pie, the Christmas wonderland on the 11th floor, closed its doors for the last time. The remaining branches were folded into Filene's, then into Macy's. The name disappeared. The building stood empty for nearly a decade before Capital Community College moved in. The Hartford Whalers joined the NHL in 1979, and for 18 years the city had a professional hockey team that gave it an identity, a reason to go downtown at night. Gordie Howe played there, already a legend, coming out of retirement for a final lap. Ron Francis, Chris Pronger, Brendan Shanahan. The Hartford Civic Center was their home, and on game nights, Main Street had life in it. Fans streaming past the insurance buildings, the bars and restaurants filling up, the city feeling like a city again. In 1997, despite an increase in season ticket sales and a state offer to build a new arena, the team's owner moved the Whalers to Raleigh, North Carolina. They became the Carolina Hurricanes. Hartford was left with a civic center and no team to play in it. To this day, you can still buy Whalers merchandise in Hartford. People wear the old green jerseys with a loyalty that borders on defiance. And through all of this, the Travelers Tower still stood. It was no longer the tallest building in Hartford. City Place 1, a bland office tower completed in 1984, had surpassed it. But it was still the most beautiful, still the one people looked for when they drove into town. The peregrine falcons had found it. They nested near the top in the stonework, and the insurance company set up a webcam so people could watch the chicks hatch. Something about that felt right. The last wild things in Hartford choosing the insurance tower to raise their young. In 2017, Hartford nearly went bankrupt. Years of shrinking population, eroding tax base, and rising pension obligations had opened a $65 million budget gap. The city had cut services, negotiated union concessions, done everything you're supposed to do, and it wasn't enough. A state bailout kept Hartford out of Chapter 9, but the brush with insolvency was a marker, the financial equivalent of an old man stumbling on a curb. You could see it coming, and you couldn't stop it, and it told you something about what lay ahead. But Hartford is not dead. That's the thing people from outside Connecticut always get wrong. The Wadsworth Athenaeum is still open. Its 50,000 objects spanning 5,000 years. Caravaggio and Cole and Dali hanging in rooms that a Hartford philanthropist built in 1844. The Mark Twain house on Farmington Avenue, where Huck Finn was written, draws visitors from all 50 states and over 60 countries. Bushnell Park still spreads its 50 acres of elm and oak below the gold dome of the state capitol. And on summer evenings, people still ride the 1914 carousel that has been spinning there since 1974. The Colt Armory Complex was designated a National Historical Park in 2014. That blue dome is now a piece of the National Park Service. The old G. Fox building has classrooms in it now. Constitution Plaza, that monument to urban renewal, was finally connected to the riverfront in the 1990s, 3 decades late, through a pedestrian bridge over Interstate 91. Officials have been working for years to remove the I-84 viaduct that cuts through downtown, trying to undo the damage of the highway era. The Connecticut Convention Center opened in 2005, the Connecticut Science Center in 2009. There is a minor league baseball stadium where the Hartford Yard Goats play. The city is trying, but downtown is quiet in the evenings and on weekends. The insurance companies that remain employ fewer people in smaller spaces, and their workers drive in from the suburbs and drive out again. The commuter population is nearly 10 times the resident population. Hartford is a city that other people use and then leave. The restaurants that food critics praise close early. The sidewalks empty by 6. The Travelers Tower still catches the light in the late afternoon, that warm terracotta glow above Main Street. The beacon at the top flashing red for the planes coming into Bradley. There's an observation deck at the 27th floor that's open to visitors in the summer. You can climb up there and look out across the valley, the river, the tobacco barns, the ridgeline, and see in every direction the places people went when they left Hartford. The suburbs are green and prosperous and quiet. The city is below you, smaller than it used to be, its streets wider than they need to be for the traffic they carry now. Somewhere down there, the blue dome of the Colt armory still rises above the South Meadows, its gilded Colt pointing toward a sky that Samuel Colt never saw, above a factory that hasn't made a gun since 1994. Elizabeth Colt rebuilt that dome after the fire of 1864 because she believed the factory belonged where her husband had put it. She used the insurance money that Hartford invented. The dome is still there, the factory is empty, the door is still open.